David Palmer is a retired professional squash player and is currently the head coach at Cornell University. David's playing achievements are too numerous to mention all of them, but he is a two-time world champion, a four-time British Open champion, and a world doubles champion. David has also won more Commonwealth Game medals than any other squash player, and he captained the Australian national team 6 times. David is a sought-after coach and has worked with many top players, including 5 players who currently rank in the top 15 in the world. In 2007, David was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia, an honor established by Queen Elizabeth II to recognize Australian citizens for outstanding achievement and service. Welcome, Dave, and thanks for joining us on Life Excellence.
No, thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
Dave, let's start out with a very basic question, and it's the one I get asked about squash more than any other question. Just what is squash?
I thought you were going to throw the Olympic question at me to start with, but
that comes later.
That comes later. Yeah, obviously, I think in America, the easiest way we explain it, it's as similar as racquetball, but much better. Similar size court, similar racket and ball, slight differences with the rules, but obviously racquetball is probably everyone in America knows what racquetball is, and slowly but surely squash is getting bigger and bigger and gaining more popularity. So, but yeah, we still get asked sometimes what squash is, or we walk into a place and we got squash on our shirts. People are a little confused, but I feel like it's getting bigger over here. It's certain, obviously East Coast, it's getting bigger, and but yeah, probably racquetball is obviously the simplest game we could compare ourselves to.
Yeah, and I love that it's growing in popularity, and it's a great sport for a variety of reasons. I read an article a while ago in Forbes and it listed the 10 healthiest sports, and squash was number 1, and it really surprised me. I know it's a great sport, great physical sport, but it surprised me that they would say that it's the number 1 healthiest sport. What makes squash not only fun and competitive, but also so healthy?
I think it's obviously it's there's no weather impact, so it's indoors, so you can play it all year round. So that's one good thing I love about it. So the courts are all indoor except for a few fun outdoor courts. But I think again it's a very there's so many aspects of the training. So as a coach, like obviously endurance is a big part of squash. You got to be very fit. Some of the matches go for 90 minutes or over, some of the top PSA matches. So the endurance is very important. You've got to be very fast, dynamic type of sport. Speed's important. Change your direction is really important. Control. And then on top of that, you've got the racket and the ball, and technique and tactics come into it, trying to control the ball. And on top of that, like all sports, there's a huge mental aspect as well. You're in a pretty small space right next to your opponent, where like you look at tennis, you're on the opposite sides of the net in tennis. Squash, you're bumping into the guy, you feel him breathing, you hear him. It's a little bit like boxers in a ring type of thing, moving around each other. So there's so many aspects of it. So when you're having a full-on match, and I think the biggest thing is all racquetball, the ball's much bouncier and it comes back to you. So a lot of the rallies are just sort of two guys or two girls standing at the back of the racquetball court. No matter where the ball, it will always come back to you. Where squash, the ball's colder, it's deader, doesn't bounce as much. So there's a lot more front-back movement involved. So when you're running from the front to the back continuously, that's where obviously your heart rate goes up. The higher your heart rate, the more calories. And I think that's sort of where they get to that calculation that you burn more calories in an hour of squash than any other sport. So,
well, it's definitely a lot of fun, and it's certainly a good workout too. We talked about the growing popularity, lack of popularity, but growing popularity in the U.S. Dave, you were born in Australia, where squash is far more popular than it is here. How did you first get interested in playing squash?
Yeah, like most Australians, it boomed. Squash really boomed back in the late 70s and 80s. Every suburb in Australia probably had a squash court. So there was plenty of access. And my parents, like most squash players, normally a family member gets you involved. And both my parents were good squash players. And Um, in Australia, you're encouraged to play sports in schools. So Australia, we're outdoors a lot. We're playing all different sports. So, but yeah, over time, squash became my favorite. But yeah, unfortunately, in recent times, the squash in Australia has died off a little bit, unfortunately. So I think it actually is growing more here in America than it is in Australia at the moment. So um, and different type of dynamic as well. You see a lot of the international coaches from Australia and England and different countries, South Africa, all over here in America coaching. And the reason is that the game's growing over here. You can make a pretty good income from being a coach in certain areas, and you've got different types of coaching as well. You've got coaching at like private country clubs, private clubs. Obviously, I've been to the one in Detroit quite a few times, the DAC, and you've got clubs like that. And then you've got some public courts, you've got public clubs, you've got some families that have private coaches. You've got high schools now that have lots of high school teams. The high school game's really growing. The teams are getting bigger. So you've got some squash coaches that are in the high school, and then you've got the college squash at the moment, which is really growing strength. So lots of different options to coach, different levels. So unfortunately in Australia, our level has dropped off. I think this is the first time we haven't had a player ranked in the top maybe 70 or 80 in the world. So as far as Australia, it's dropped off, but we're really excited, and it's fun to be over here in America while the game's sort of still new in a lot of places and sort of at the grassroots level growing. So.
Yeah, I think squash in the U.S. is it's popular on the East Coast where you are now, obviously, but the Midwest and the West Coast, and I guess you know better than I do, but I'm not sure outside the East Coast. Hopefully, it's expanding and.
Yeah, there's certain pockets where it's getting bigger. Obviously, the in California, San Francisco, in the Bay Area, there's lots of clubs there, and that's actually some of the top juniors now. Obviously, with college, we're following all the juniors and with our recruiting, and a lot of the top juniors are coming from the West Coast. So there's lots of good programs over in California, in San Francisco. There's been a couple of big clubs in Houston, Texas, starting to grow as well now. So you're seeing a lot more juniors come out of that, and there's a couple of big junior tournaments being held down there as well. So, and then you've got pockets of courts like in Detroit, in Cleveland, and cities like that. But we definitely have lots of room to still grow. Obviously, it's heavily populated, sort of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, down to Washington D.C. But yeah, definitely lots of area. There's not much. I used to live before here. I was coaching down in Florida, and there's not many squash courts down in Florida. So there's definitely room for growth down there. And like you said, the Midwest is still plenty of untapped places. So it'd be great to see the game continue to grow. I know at the college level, we're looking to add more teams and try to get some of these bigger universities and big football and basketball programs to look at adding maybe a squash program as well.
What's happened in Australia? What is squash being replaced by?
I think just unfortunately, I think it boomed. It boomed back in the 80s where every club, like I said, every suburb had big clubs, 10, 12 courts. Didn't really have to do anything. They just was popular. You open the doors and the courts would be reserved solidly through the daytime and nighttime. I think they didn't maybe do enough development in the schools. We had lots of great players, but sometimes that can be a kiss of death when you're producing good players all the time. You think it's going to continue forever, and if you're not getting that grassroots level, and I don't think they did enough development to keep the game popular in the schools. Like you got to always keep having a new generation of juniors coming in, and I think other sports came in, and you've got lots of sports in Australia, and I think squash sort of died away a little bit, and then the real estate in Australia really took off and boomed, and you had these huge squash facilities in prime locations. So when the popularity died off, the owners struggled, so they sold the properties and they were turned into apartments or knocked down, and other things were put up. So we've probably lost, unfortunately, over 50% of the squash courts in Australia over recent times. So it's something that, again, there's always going to be something new, and it's if you're not doing the level at the beginner level, the young kids, getting them in, getting them liking it. There's 10 other sports or 20 other sports that will get their interest. So, but again, obviously, I know that I'm still a little bit involved with Squash Australia. I've been helping some of the committees and on the selection panels. And I know they're trying to regroup it, and they just held a PSA event last week, and there's a bigger PSA event in New Zealand this week. So they're trying to rebuild it. But yeah, it's tough when you lose squash courts. So, but we'll see. Hopefully, we can see. It's a different generation. Like back then, it was Australia, England, Pakistan had the two best players of all times in the men's game. Um, and then now it's countries like Egypt is really strong. You've got some South American countries producing some great players as well. England's still reasonably strong. So it's nice to see some different countries coming involved as well. India has a lot of good players as well. And obviously in America, on the women's side, is very strong. I think the top 3 or 4 women players are all in the top 16 in the world. So it's definitely paying off on that side. And but yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see in the next 10 years. Obviously, Egypt is by far the biggest producer of top players, and I think America is slowly catching them in juniors, and that will transfer over to PSA as well.
Well, hopefully that continues, and that'll obviously help too with the popularity of the sport. If we
Mm-hmm.
can see um, players competing, on the world stage, and that'll definitely create more models and get kids more interested. And as they're exposed to it, maybe they tend to at least take that on, and
Mm-hmm.
it'll some of them
Yeah.
will take off with it, and others will move on. Let's talk more about when you were growing up. So you said your parents played, you grew up playing. I think you turned pro around the age of 19. Tell us about the evolution of your game from recognizing that you were a pretty good squash player to then becoming a really good squash player, and how that happened, and then eventually turning pro and competing internationally. What did you need to do to get to the next level and eventually turn pro?
Yeah, it was something like, again, growing up in Australia, it was always encouraged to play sports. So squash was one of my favorites, but I played soccer and cricket and did cross country, and I did lots of sports. So it's sort of, that's the way the country is, and we remember going away from school as much as I can. If I could get on a sporting team and I could get out of going to school, that was always a fun thing. So but yeah, it was probably around the age of 14 that I realized that squash was my favorite, and that's the one I wanted to do the most. So I sort of cut back the other sports and put all my efforts into squash with training and playing tournaments. Yeah, my parents were very good to me, and I realize, being a father now, what they did to me, and what they gave me the opportunity, and drove me everywhere, and gave me the opportunity to be as good as I wanted to be without putting too much pressure on me. So I'm at the time, I probably didn't see it. I definitely didn't see it as a afterwards, and my success. I saw it now. Being a father, I really see what they did to me. So I was really fortunate and grateful the experience they gave me, and then yeah, I think as a junior, I was a good junior, but I wasn't the best junior. And every age, I sort of got better. So by the time by the time I was 17, I was probably number 2 in Australia, and then by the time I was 19, under 19s, I got to number 1. Um, I went overseas when I was 18. My coach, I think it was a bit of a test. He was Joe Shaw was his name, and he was a bit of a mentor of the game and guru of the game, and was a bit of the left field with some of his ideas. And he took me over to South America, and there was a big tour over there, and I joined PSA, and I was like 400 in the world. I was last on the list, and I was able to get into like about 8 to 10 tournaments over there. So I ended up spending about 5 months away, and I think that decision to do that sort of transformed my career. It scares me now to think about it, that I chose to do that. That I went away. Uh, I try to tell my daughters now, like, there was no phones back then. There was no internet really. I had to use a payphone to call mom and dad, write letters, and it scares me to think about how I did that, or how I navigated it all back then without any of that technology that we have today. But it definitely showed me how much I wanted it, and it was definitely hard to be away, but it made me hungry to succeed. And I had pretty good success. I came back about 80 in the world, and then I continued after that. And then I made the big decision when I was 20 to move over to Europe. Australia was strong with lots of players, but all the tournaments were sort of in Europe and Asia and in the Middle East, and Australia was too far to travel always back and forth. So it was pretty common back in the day that the Australian players would sort of set up a base in Europe, and it was a good time. So I found a good base over in Belgium, and that's where I started to work with my coach, long-term coach Sean Moxham. And I played leagues in Europe where they pay you to play for a team, and it was really a fun experience playing matches and getting paid. And it was a way I was funding everything myself, so it was a way I could sort of survive. And I worked when I started with Sean, I was about 30 in the world, and he was also a former PSA player and a very good coach. And I started to work with him, and then we had quick success and up into the top 10, and then from there it just kept building and building. And he was my long-term coach pretty much all the way through to the end of my career. So, but yeah, it was, the early days were tough, but I was lucky. My wife, who was with me then, Melinda, she came over with me and traveled around with me, and we lived in sort of Europe 9-10 months of the year, and having her over there as well was a good balance for me as well. Kept me on the straight and narrow, and it all fell into place. But yeah, hard work. Um, but yeah, that's sort of roughly how I remember it.
Yeah, you mentioned PSA a couple times, and then you
Mhm.
mentioned the European league that you played in. Can you
Yep,
just for our audience
sure.
explain what the PSA is and how that
Yep,
fit into
yep.
what you were doing professionally?
Yeah, so the PSA is the Professional Squash Association. So it's a little bit like the ATP or the NBA. So it's the same type of thing as the tennis tour, where you join and then you play tournaments and you get a ranking, and the better you do, the more ranking points you get, the more tournaments you play, you move up the rankings. And obviously the goal was to get as high as I could, top 10, top 20 originally, then top 10, and then obviously with the big goal of eventually one day being world number one. And it's like tennis, where you the different level prize money, the better you do in the tournaments, the more money you get. So the more money you earn. So um, the European leagues were a bit of a different thing that was separate from PSA, and it was really popular in my generation that a lot of the clubs in Europe would have professional teams, and they would have different players, and different sort of, some teams were four players in a team, some were three. Um, some leagues you had to have a certain number of international players and a certain number of local players, but they were on a night. The clubs in Europe were really fun as well back then. They were sort of like a squash club with a bar in it, so the bar was right next to the squash courts, and then you get a big crowd to come in, and it was a sort of whole night of squash and sort of entertainment. So for me, it was a perfect way to incorporate getting good matches, good match practice for the pro tournaments leading into them. So
And so you really had quite a remarkable career. You were a pro, I think, 16 years. I believe that I read you were in the top 10 in PSA for 10 years, which is pretty impressive.
mhm.
How did people describe your game, or maybe how do you describe how would you describe your game when you were at the pinnacle of your profession? So, what did people say about David Palmer when they were writing about him, or when they were talking about you when you're at the pinnacle of your career?
Yep. I think the TV commentators, my nickname on the tour, and the sort of all the players get a nickname at some point. Mine was the Marine. So mine was, I was definitely at one point, I feel like I was probably the fittest guy on the tour, with a combination of being mentally very strong, good under pressure. But yeah, I was physically very strong. I'm 6'2". I was quick around the court. I move well. I feel my game developed over the years with the help of Sean. Probably my old original coach had the theory of, if I was the fittest player and mentally the strongest player, if it took me 2 hours to win a match, then I would win the match. But obviously, we realized after a while, that probably got me to like top 30 in the world. But I sort of probably for a 6 month period, I got stuck at 30 in the world where I wasn't moving up. And then that's when I moved to Sean, and Sean was more of a technical coach, and we combined both of keeping me the fittest player, mentally the strongest, and then Sean made changes to my game technically and tactically to make me a more attacking player. So, and then the whole combination worked really well, and I was very consistent over the years, and that's why I was able to stay around the top rankings for such a long period of time. So yeah, I had it. I was tall. I volleyed a lot. I hit the ball hard. I moved well. And again, I was a lot of my big wins were very close matches where I came through right at the bitter end to win matches or save match points and win some big titles. But yeah, my mental strength was also so. I was very fortunate that the coaches that I worked with worked well together and different areas and. Even to this day, I'm still now coaching myself. I still think back to a lot of the stuff that I learned, and it's still very relevant in today's coaching and in today's game. Obviously, every sport's getting more modern and changes with technology, but the core, what I went through when I came through, I think is still very relevant today. So.
I know in tennis, many of the top players, especially the top men's players, are tall. They're 6'2", 6'3", and where that helps them is with the service, though, and it's different in tennis than it is in squash. Are many of the top players in squash also tall like you? I mean, I would think wingspan helps. It's hard to pass somebody who's 6'2", and but is that a characteristic of many of the top players, or you just happen to be tall?
It's a little bit of a mix. So yeah, definitely. And I follow tennis pretty closely, so I know being tall in tennis, there is a huge advantage with the serve. I wouldn't say as much in squash. You've got a good mix. Like I was 6'2", but there was guys in my era that were 6'4", 6'5". There was also guys that were 5'3", 5'4". So I think at the end of the day in squash, if you're tall, then like you said, you use your wingspan, you sort of use your height across the tee, you volleyed a lot. The smaller guys were probably faster, a little bit maybe in and out of the front corners a little quicker. They were a bit more dynamic around the court. So there's definitely, even today, there's a good mix in the top 10 of different sizes and heights and width of players. So, but yeah, it's not as dominant as in tennis or other sports like basketball. Obviously, you have to be tall in basketball.
Sure.
But yeah, squash. It's more like obviously, yeah. It's again, if you're tall, yeah, there's definitely advantages if you can use them. Obviously, there's disadvantages because it's if you're tall, you are a lot of the squash movements is lunging in and out of the corners. You got to get low. So if you're really tall, getting low is harder. And if you're on the shorter side, getting in and out of the corners is probably easier, but it's more difficult for you to stand on the tee and volley and cut balls off because you're not as don't have the length of or the width to get across to the balls. So yeah, it's not as dominant as in some sports, I would say, that's for sure.
Yeah. Dave, one of the things we strive for on the show is to identify what it takes to be the absolute best in one's chosen profession. And you can say that you very definitively were the absolute best a couple different times at your in the sport of squash. You talked about this a little bit. You talked about height. You talked about the mental game as well as fitness. But what did you have to do to become world champion as opposed to, say, and you mentioned being stuck at 30. So being 30th or being in the top 50 or the top 100. What's the distinction between the top and not even to become world champion, but to get into the top 5 versus being at 30?
Yep. Yeah, again, I think it's the day-to-day things. It's again, it's like any sport. It's the work ethic that you have every time you. And again, I've known now with the coaching front. I've coached juniors, low-level juniors, good juniors. I'm now in the college game. I've coached pro players. So the top guys, they're doing it. Again, squash is not obviously as a financial reward is not there compared to a lot of other sports. So it's one thing we get asked a little bit is like, why are we playing squash for? Because the money's not there compared to like tennis or golf or other mainstream sports in America. But the passion to be able to call yourself a professional athlete, and you have a world ranking, and that means a lot to a lot of the players around the world. So the money, obviously, yes, it's important, but having the chance to be world top 10 or world number one or win a major title definitely outweighs that. But I think it's it's the day in, day out work ethic that you bring, making the sacrifices. I look at, there's four main areas in squash I look at. Obviously, there's the physical part, there's the technique part, there's the tactical part, and the mental part. And I feel all four of those areas have to be very, very, very strong. Continually got to work on. I think the golf is a good example. The technique in golf is really important. Squash, the technique's very important as well. Squash is very fast, but it's all muscle memory. The ball comes so fast. There's no time. And I mentioned golf, where golf is the complete opposite. You can, yeah, and I like golf. I play golf a lot. I think it's a very similar swing in some ways. That's why people often think tennis and squash is similar, but actually tennis is really bad for squash, and probably vice versa. Tennis coaches don't like squash. Squash don't like the tennis coaches, because it's a totally different swing, totally different grip. Tennis, it's a big swing, lots of rotation, trying to hit the ball hard. Squash is more smoother and rhythm. And I like the golf to compare it much more similar. So golf is not about, you see the top players, they're very smooth with their swing and they hit it 350 yards down the fairway. And squash is very similar. So under pressure, your technique has to stand up, your decision making has to stand up. Split second decisions with your heart rate at the max. Like, it's nice. Some of the pro tournaments, the players where the heart rate, so you see that as well. And they're like at 190, 200 beats, and they're maxing out, but they've got to make on the spot decisions on how to move to the ball, shot selections, how to deal with their opponent. That's what makes it great. And again, it's those things that you have to work on a day-to-day basis. And like anything, it's finding the 1-2% advantages over your career. And again, I think at the end of the day, the mental side, I feel, is still the biggest side of it. Having your technique, having everything stand up under pressure. When it gets to that critical moment in the match where it's 9-all, 10-all, there's one point left. That's when the true sort of champion and all the hard work pays off for. And that's what separates. Like in squash, you talked about the top 30. You probably got the top 10. Then there's probably a break between 10 and 15, and then there's a break between 15 and 30. I know in some sports, maybe in tennis, it's not so uncommon for a number 30 in the world to beat a top 5 from time to time, but that rarely happens in squash. Normally the top 10 guys are not losing to the guys outside the top 12 in the world. So I don't know why that is, but that's sort of the reality of it. So
yeah, interesting. So you're at Cornell now, where you're the head coach of squash. Share a little, and you've mentioned your coach and how your coach helped take you to the next level. Share a little more about the value of coaching you received during your career. How is that helpful to you?
Yeah, again, I was very fortunate to have two big coaches in my career. Obviously, and I think back to what my parents did for me as well, and being a father of two daughters who are both athletic and both into sports. I got one squash player. My youngest daughter is playing squash, so that's fun. But my older daughter is a volleyball player, and I love that as much as well. I love to see her play and being successful at that. But I think, again, I look back to, there's a big thing with squash I think in all sports, that kids don't get burnt out. A lot of pressure from parents, a lot of pressure from parents wanting it more than their kids and pushing. And I often get asked, like, my oldest daughter never liked squash. She never wanted to play, and I never forced her to play. And people are like, "You're crazy! Like, make her play squash. For sure, she's going to be good." But she never wanted to play. So, like, I didn't make her play. She found volleyball as her love, and I think that's great. My youngest daughter, she liked it a little bit, and then she went away from it and she played other sports, and then she's come back to it now, and she's fallen in love with it herself, which I think is great, without me having to force her to come to squash. And it's a complete opposite. I've had lots of long days, and I've been some day 12-hour days coaching at the school here, and I'm ready to go home, and she wants to come in and play, and I think that's great. So I think the lessons I've learned, I try to install them in the team here. The college game is really, it's a great time to be involved in college sports. And I've been at Cornell now 6 years. I coach the men's and the women's program, so that's also a different dynamic, coaching both teams. There's not many. There's a few coaches that do that, but mostly there's a separate men's coach for the men's team and a separate head coach for the women's. But I'm doing both, so that's different dynamic, as you can imagine. So I'm managing. I have about 15, 16 girls on my women's team, and I've got about 16 to 18 boys on the boys team. So we're managing about 32, 33 athletes, which is a lot. I've got a full-time assistant coach, Mark Burke, and he's a big help to me. And but yeah, it's a great time to be involved in college squash, and I feel like we're just getting started with it, and I really think we can build up. I think we have about 35 or 40 varsity programs and about another 25, 30 club teams across America. And we obviously the Ivy schools are very strong in the college sports. In the college squash. And then outside of that, you've got the Trinity is very strong over the years. Has been one of the biggest programs in squash. The men's program at Trinity has the record I think the record in all college sports for the 13 seasons undefeated. So that's a
Wow.
pretty unique thing to have. Paul Azazante at Trinity. And then you've got new programs. UVA has a very strong program now. Drexel in Philadelphia has a strong program. So you're starting to get some other areas of schools getting involved as well. So, but yeah, I'm enjoying it. I've been here 6 years, and I see myself here, long term.
What do you enjoy most about coaching college players?
I think I find the squash piece is easy in some ways. The on the court coaching them, working on the technique, working on the game is the easier part. The team dynamic, getting the team to work together is the hardest piece. Like we do recruiting. I've got a mix of some international players and mostly American players, but you're bringing together 15, 16 people that don't know each other, or sometimes were rivals in juniors and now they're on the same team together. Getting them to work. Squash is a fun dynamic. It's an individual sport, but it's a team sport in college. So I find that's interesting. Like you're an individual because there's in a team match 9 players play, so there's 9 men's play again. So if we're playing, we just played the Ivy scrimmages on the weekend. And yesterday we played Columbia, so there's 9 men play and 9 women play. And you've got to win 5 out of the 9 matches to get the overall team win. But every match is still an individual match. So it's one person, one of our players playing against one of their players. So you've got the dynamic that it is an individual sport, but your outcome affects the team result. So, and that's a big part of our team culture that we're trying to build and continue to build over time. So I enjoy that part of it a lot. The recruiting is difficult. It's very competitive. Spend a lot of hours reviewing videos and film. Obviously, during the COVID period was very tough when kids couldn't come. We had two recruiting cycles where we couldn't meet the kids in person really because of the COVID. But obviously, thank God we're through that now, and we're back at tournaments and we're back meeting kids. We've got kids coming for visits. So I enjoy that piece of it, trying to piece together a team that are willing to work hard, especially at the Ivy League schools. That education obviously is still very important, and education here is always number one. And we hope squash and the team is number 2, and then all the other aspects of college, the social life and the fun is further down the list. So we're looking. The recruiting is very important. There's no crystal ball, so trying to recruit kids that want to continue over the 4 years, want to continue to work hard to improve their game, are open to changing, open to working together, being a good team leader. There's so many different aspects, and I think that's what I enjoy the most about it. It's probably why I've got more grey hair now as well. But at the end of the day, it's still very enjoyable, and we're working hard. We're trying to move up. We're competitive. Um, we finished ninth last season overall, so we want to try to push up into the top 8 this year. And again, I still have that competitive edge from my playing days and my coaching. I don't like to lose. I want to play hard. I want to play fair. I want my kids to have the same attitude, and having that difference, knowing that again the hard work, and that's what we're trying to. It's a long season. We start in August and we train sort of in the preseason a little bit, and then we go into season and we try to maximize our training hours, obviously, which are restricted at an Ivy League school. We only get them for a certain amount of hours each day, and outside of that, they've got to navigate studies and school and everything. So, but yeah, there's so many different aspects that I really like about it. Not just the match days or not just the wins. It's the day in, day out, seeing them, getting to know them. Yeah, it's I really enjoy it.
Well, and you're on a college campus, which is a great environment too. So you're coaching the Cornell men's team, the Cornell women's team, and you've also had the opportunity to work with some pretty amazing, currently top ranked players. How do those relationships evolve, and what does that look like from a coaching or a mentoring standpoint? Are you doing that concurrently with college coaching, or what does that look like?
Yeah, it started before I was at Cornell. I was 7 years down in Florida, and I moved just at the end of my career. I got an offer from a couple of families, believe it or not, from Orlando to move down and coach their kids. And we were looking for a bit of a change. We were in Boston, and the idea of going south to the warm weather was appealing. My daughters were very young at that moment, and we thought, why not? And ended up not knowing if it would be a 1 year thing, and it ended up to be 7 years, and worked with different families down there, coaching their kids, sort of with the idea of getting them good enough to be recruited at a top program. So that was sort of the first. So I was sort of on the other side of the fence back then. I was a coach working with the player. And then when I got down there, I got asked by a few PSA players, could I come and train? And long story short, I sort of set up my own academy down there as well, because obviously I had plenty. I coached the kids after school, so I sort of had all day free to do sort of what I wanted to. So I would, sorry. So I started to work with a few squash pros, and they came down and based themselves down there, and I would work with them through the day. I'd coach them in the mornings early. I coach them early afternoons, and then I'd go over and then coach the 5 or 6 kids that I had in the junior program. So, and it grew quickly from there. I had some good success, and I took some players quickly up into the top 10, and they won lots of titles. And then I worked with one of the top Egyptian players, Mohamed Shobagi, and he was formerly world number one, and he was going through a bit of a bad period, and he dropped back a little bit, and we started to work together. And so when I moved to Cornell, I wanted to try to keep that aspect, maybe not as many players, but I sort of still had ambitions to coach a little bit in the PSA still. So I sort of continued it up here in Ithaca as well in Cornell. So it's the same type of thing. Obviously, we have lots of work to do, but the team trains late in the afternoons up here. So I would bring up players. I thought it would be fun for the team to have some world-class players around while I'm finishing training and the team's walking in to see a world number one on the court training. You would only hope that it's inspirational for them as well. So,
Absolutely.
So obviously during the COVID period, it sort of backed off a little bit. Obviously, everything shut down with traveling, and there was a few changes as well, like the I couldn't travel to all the tournaments because obviously my main job was at Cornell, and our squash season's a winter sport, so we're really busy sort of from November till March. So I couldn't travel to the tournaments, but before COVID, there was all the tournaments were streamed, and I could call the player between games. So it was a pretty unique situation. I could be sitting home, it could be 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm watching a match somewhere on the other side of the world. And then in between games, they come off, put their headphones on, and I'd be on the phone to them, and I'd be talking to them like I would be if I was there in person. And lots of coaches were doing that, and then that was good for a couple of years. And then the professional game made a rule that they decided they didn't want players doing that, and that's a different topic. But they stopped doing that, so that sort of made it a little bit difficult to coach as many players as I maybe wanted to, because I couldn't travel to all the tournaments that I probably needed to. So I've had periods where I've sort of probably recently I've got busier again. I'm still actively coaching 3 or 4 players at the moment that are all in the top sort of 12, top 15 in the world. And they come up here in between tournaments, different times of the year, to work with me. Sometimes it's for a week, sometimes it's 3 weeks. It just depends on their schedule. But I still enjoy the program. I still watch it a lot. Like I said, my daughter's into it. She sits down and watches it with me, so I like that part of it. I still enjoy watching the pro game, learning from it, looking at the top players, studying them. I feel like no matter who you were or what level you are, you can always still learn things. And I'm looking for that edge, anything I can use to give the edge to my team here at Cornell. So I still enjoy the PSA and coaching the pro players.
And so if a pro player is going to, let's say they travel to Ithaca and they're
Mhm.
going to be there for a week, what
Yep.
what does that look like? What are you doing specifically with them
Yep.
during those mornings? How
Yep.
long are those
Yep.
is your time with them? What are you working on? What are you
Sure.
talking about? What are you doing through the week?
Sure. Yeah, normally the morning session. So normally we'd start early, like 8:39, and probably go for like 90 minutes. And it would be more of a probably the morning session. I try to base it more on a technique, tactical type of session, and then the afternoon session would be early afternoons, because Cornell normally the teams come in and train from about 4 o'clock, so I have to be ready for the team. So we normally in the afternoon session it might be like 1:30 to 3, and that might be more match play, it might be more fitness in the afternoon. It's nice when I have a couple players here because I can pair them up together as well. So but yeah, it's again it depends a little bit also. Like obviously every player is differently, and I treat everybody individually, and certain players obviously, like in any sport, need different things we're working on. Um, so yeah, and um, I try to design. I know when they're coming. I'll put it on paper. Okay, we've got them for 7 days. What's their next tournaments? It depends a little bit how they've been doing in their previous tournaments. What's been working? What's not been working? How can I help them prepare for the next one? So it could be it could be on technique, it could be on movement, it could be a combination of a couple things, or it could be that they're right in the groove, they're right in the zone, and I've just got to keep them healthy and keep them on track. So it's a little bit individual, very individual, depending on where they are, and where they are in the season as well. Sometimes the squash season sort of starts in September and goes all the way through till probably May, and then the summer is off a little bit as well. So again, I'm trying to get them to peak. You still have big tournaments like the World Championships. You've still got the British Open. You've got some big tournaments in America. They just had the US Open last couple 3 or 4 weeks ago in Philadelphia, at the brand new. There's a really beautiful new national center in Philadelphia that was built. So a lot of big tournaments there now. So, but yeah, the pro players, it just depends a little bit, sort of where I feel I can help them the most. And um, 5 to 7 days is not such a long period of time. If ideally 2 to 3 weeks is where you can really sort of make changes. So, but I know sometimes in the schedule they can only come for 5 days or 6 days, but so we make it work depending what they really need at the moment.
Yeah. So we've talked about playing at the professional level, playing at the college level.
Hmm.
Let's reduce the skill level even further and talk about the club level.
Hmm.
If you were coaching somebody who, let's say, knows the basics of the game, is a decent player, maybe a 4.0, 4.5, what kinds of things should that player do to improve in order to take his or her game to the next level? And by the way, I'm asking for a friend.
Okay. um, Again, after watching them, I feel again I'd be not complicating it. I find obviously a 4.0 to a 4.4 or 4.0 to a 5.0 is obviously there is a step up in that to go from a 4.0 to a 5. There has to be some pretty good improvements. I think people overcomplicate it, and especially these days, there's so many coaching videos, so many things that you can watch, which are good, but can be also too contradicting or too confusing. So I would be just trying to pick one or two things to work on. Where are my winning points and where are my losing points? And not to a lot of it's still basic stuff. Like a lot of points are won still on the serve and the return of serve. So they're often the first at a club level. They would be the first two things I would be looking at. Obviously, movement is important depending how old they are. Um, that's the nice thing about squash that you can have different ages and you could have a good 60-year-old guy play and be competitive with someone in their mid 30s because the older generation style is going to play smarter, play a little slower. The younger person's going to try to play fast and just hit the ball hard. So I think it's great that you can have different ages, different levels play against each other. But I think just in general, I think just trying to keep it very simple and picking one or two things to focus on and not thinking 10 things. Squash is very fast. It's muscle memory. Um, and I think the basic technique obviously has to be looked at as well because it's hard to improve if you're doing the same mistake over and over again. If you're not holding the grip correctly or your start of your swing is wrong, if you're doing that continuously, it's hard no matter how hard you try. If you don't make changes, then it's going to be the same every time. The ball will come in the middle of the court or it will hit the tin. So for me, it's trying to keep it pretty basic and simple, I suppose, which probably sounds a little boring, but that's the way it is. The simple again, the top squash players at all levels, all ages, make it look easy and smooth and move around the court like they're not even really running and have the control. And I think power is overrated in squash. I think that's something as well. I think people try to, especially coming from other sports, maybe like tennis or racquetball, they think the power is more, but I feel power in squash at the right moments is effective, but it's the undoing of a lot of bad habits and errors as well.
Yeah, that's great feedback, great insight, and I appreciate that. You mentioned right at the beginning the Olympics question, and of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask it. In spite of the worldwide popularity, I read that there are about 20 million people who play squash in almost every country of the world. And not only is squash not an Olympic sport, but I just read that it was passed over for the 2024 Paris Olympics by breakdancing, sport climbing, skateboarding, and surfing. Why hasn't squash found its way into the Olympics? And do you think it ever will, Dave?
It's a frustrating thing. It's definitely not from the lack of effort. I've been involved in the game now for 25, 30 years, and it's not definitely from a lack of effort. I know the professional PSA, the World Squash Federation, have tried multiple times to gain entry into the Olympics and going through the IOC and giving presentations. And a lot of the players over their time have been very generous with their efforts to go and do exhibitions and talks. And so it's definitely not from a lack of effort from the players or any of the organizations. Again, I really don't know. There's lots of different factors. Like I don't know why it wasn't added years ago when sports like badminton and table tennis were put into the Olympics. That one I don't know. You would think back when they were added that squash would have been added as well. Obviously, I know tennis got added a lot later than those sports as well. So obviously, I've been fortunate to compete at the Commonwealth Games a number of times, and the Commonwealth Games is probably the as close to the Olympics format as we got. And yeah, I suppose it was frustrating to see how great the Commonwealth Games was, and to know that the Olympics would be another higher level, and we never were able to achieve it. But we seem to tick all the boxes, like you said, number of players, number of countries. We're not really a complicated sport. Like to put up a squash court, the glass court, you've seen we're very fortunate. Like I've played World Opens in front of the pyramids in Egypt, where they put a glass court up in front, like 100 feet from the pyramids.
Wow.
There's a tournament in Grand Central Station every year, run from by John Nimick, who's one of our best promoters. One an amazing setting. So we've been very fortunate to have these glass courts that really can go up anywhere in a shopping mall, outdoors, indoors. But yeah, it's frustrating. I think recent times, I suppose they're looking to get the younger generation more involved. So that's why they're looking at younger. I suppose I think they probably think that squash is a little old and tired and boring, and the young kids are more maybe interested in breakdancing or rock climbing or I think from a professional point of view, I think we've been frustrated that they added sometimes tennis early on. Tennis, a lot of the top players never played the Olympics because it was always clashing with the US Open, and they saw the Grand Slam bigger than the Olympics. So often
Right.
early on, in recent times, it's got better, but I think that was a frustration. I think in the Rio Olympics, they added golf, and none of the top golf players went to play it. So that's a frustrating. And I love golf, but I think if you add a sport in the Olympics, you've got to have your best players play it and compete for it. So um, I hope. I know we tried hard for Paris and it didn't get in. I hear, if I'm correct, I think the 2028 Olympics is in LA, I believe, or is it 28 Paris? Maybe 28 is Paris.
24 is Paris, so I
24 is
think you're right.
Paris.
I
So
think
28, I
28 is
think, is
LA.
back in LA.
Yeah.
And we're hoping that the popularity of squash, I think it's been added possibly to a short list of sports in consideration for the 2028 one. Um, but I won't lie, what we're hearing is pickleball is the front
You got to be
is
kidding.
the front runner as well.
Jeez.
And yeah, that's a sports that's definitely taken off. So I think our game again. I think we don't get enough TV coverage. I don't think, like, not to go on too much, but I think um, sports have to be live. Like we have this really good streaming site through the PSA, and you can watch the tournaments, and it looks great. But at the end of the day, it's got to be on live TV. It's got to be on the ESPNs and the sport channels or the NBCs, and it's got to be on Saturday, Sunday afternoons. And it hurts me to switch the TV on Sunday afternoon, and I see pickleball, and I see some crazy spike ball, and I see cornhole on ESPN. So I think that's one thing where we're lacking. We don't get, for some reason, we're never live on TV on the big sports channels. And again, that's what people are watching, and that's unfortunately we haven't been able to sort of. And I think that's a combination of why I think the Olympics looks at squash and maybe thinks that we're a little old and a little boring, and they're looking for newer, younger things to try to get the younger generation um, excited for the Olympics. Is probably where I think it is, but
Yeah.
definitely not giving up. I know that obviously I'm not as involved as I used to be with it, but I definitely would love to see it in there one day. It definitely deserves it. That's for sure.
Yeah, I really hope it happens. And you mentioned young players, and you've brought that up again. You talked about Australia sort of moving away from squash and really needing to introduce it with younger players. What advice do you have for younger players who are interested in taking up the sport, either as just a way to have fun and stay healthy and fit, or maybe even to compete at the college level or national or even international level?
I think it's a again. I think it's a great. It's a healthy sport. It's only problem is that, again, we still don't have enough court access to the general public, so it's something we still need to add a lot more public courts, a lot more access. But there's definitely a lot more schools getting involved, high schools, middle schools that are adding squash courts and programs, and that's really great. But once you're at a club, it is sort of inexpensive. Rackets are not that expensive. You don't need a lot of equipment. I think that's a positive. You can play it year round. There's no weather impacts, not like an outdoor sport. So I think it's something that, again, I think it's a great game, and I feel it's a life game. Once you get into squash, I feel you don't need to be involved with squash for the rest of your life, and you might go away from it. And it's popular in the college. I've already seen it in my 6 or 7 years that players play it in juniors. They get recruited to college. They play 4 years of college squash. Then they get a great job, and then they work in the city or one of the big cities, and they might stop playing. And then all of a sudden, they're 5, 10 years, they get back involved again with it, and they're back playing again. And you've got the hardball doubles, which is a bit of a smaller tour. That's on a bigger court, but that's an option as well when squash becomes a little bit too hard to play. The singles part of it. So, but I think kids just got to, again, give it a try. I think once you get into it, you'll understand it. It's really a fun game, and it's still a good numbers game. Like I still think if you're looking to get your kids an opportunity to play in college or high school, we're definitely at still low numbers compared to the mainstream sports in America, compared to the kids that are playing soccer, basketball, volleyball, tennis, golf. You're talking like hundreds of thousands of kids, and squash, we're nowhere near that amount. So with the recruiting in the college, there's still a very good chance. You don't need to be number one or top five in your age. There's kids ranked 25, 30, 40 in the country, and they're still getting recruited to really great programs. So it's a good numbers game at the moment for college. And but yeah, it's a safe, fairly inexpensive, healthy sport.
Yeah, it's a great sport. It's a lot of fun. It's certainly a great workout, and the people who play it are pretty good people too.
Yeah.
Dave, thanks so much for being on the show today. It's been great getting to know you, and I love that we're exposing our audience to the great sport of squash.
Yeah, no, happy to talk, happy to spread. It's nice to think about my career. I don't bring it up much, so it's nice to hear it every now and then to put a smile on my face. And I think it's great that, again, any new people, it can only help grow our sport. So happy to be here anytime. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks again. And to our listeners and viewers, thanks for tuning into Life Excellence. Please support the show by subscribing, sharing it with others, posting about today's show with squash pro David Palmer, and leaving a rating and review. You can also learn more about me at brianbartes.com. Until next time, dream big dreams and make each day your masterpiece.